So this year I'm presenting on the theoretical framework of governance by algorithms. It's more about hypothesis, about generating new hypotheses for empirical testing. So last year I gave a more concrete, specific example of the social credit as an empirical case study. But this year I want to explore a bit more on this hypothesis of governance by algorithms. And so what do I mean? And what's the big question here? I guess after 2 days of discussions, almost 2 days, that we know that a big question right now is does like the code and law debate, right? So does code replace law? Like yesterday's presentation, we've talked different things about argumentation and adjudication. And last year, my presentation was automated law enforcement. So there is this big substitution hypothesis in the field about code versus law, that legal singularity, for example, that it kind of proposes or hypothesizes that after a certain point, law will reach to like a granular level because machine learning is so good that everybody will have their own law, or it can be fully automated. Another another tangent argument in other articles would suggest would the state or text-driven laws with the so-called modern law, the functions in society, slowly fade into the background, just like once the organized religions that dominated legitimacy is also slowly fading, but giving way to the emergence of modern law as the dominant way of governance. And would the new kind of code pave the way towards a similar transition? So that's the substitution hypothesis. And we've witnessed also like so for people not doing legal automation, like ChatGPT passed the law bar exam. I'm sure it has been mentioned a million times. And the UK legal tech has provided like US law firms and their clients with a little Bluetooth on their ear so that they can listen in the court on like small traffic cases. Whenever a judge asks them a question, they can listen to the AI telling them what to say to the judge. But this was banned by the US lawyers in the court. We don't know what happened now, but I think at last time I checked, it's still not allowed to use in court. So there's also other cases of adjudication enforcement. We don't need to go into the detail of those, but a larger framework of this kind of law versus code debate, you can have also like the general theories of, for example, surveillance capitalism. Like in their Zuboff used a lot of empirical case studies and interviews, for example, in Google. And she mentioned a very interesting case about the smart contract, which she calls on-contract, imagining a mother driving in a semi-autonomous car, like an autonomous car, and in a blizzard, trying to see her sick child in the hospital, but suddenly the smart contract terminated her contract of hiring this car, and she was stuck in this blizzard. And also in China, there's also the automated enforcement in the social credit, and there's also the rating system. So there's big debates about, in a systematic level, how code will slowly reform or kind of replace or bring to like negative consequences. And this paper proposed a new theoretical framework to answer this kind of a big question: is law computable, or whether the code will replace text-driven law fully or systematically. So there are a few kind of literature I've listed, the recent discussions on this. So I'm proposing a descriptive framework of layering, which is based on institutional theory of governance. The argument is that governance by algorithm is a hybrid. It's not a single mode of governance. It's a hybrid of 4 modes of governance, which have an increased level of abstraction from social norms to laws to statistics or numbers and to code. So they have, it's just like this picture of the Earth. You have different layers from the internal, the most core part, to the external, exterior crests. And each layer, by building on each other, have a path dependency and they have complementarity between each other. And law as an intermediate level of abstraction can channel feedback from both upwards from social norms or downwards from numbers and code. So it's an alternative hypothesis to substitution I'm proposing here, which argues that law and code are complements. It also kind of borrows the idea from economics that as substitutes, it means the increase of one product will decrease the other product or entity. In complement, if they are complements, the increase of one or usually increase the other. So instead of code making law fading into the background or replaces it, they both increase as governance becomes more complex. And I want to highlight in the very beginning, again, that like last year, this is not a normative framework. It's very descriptive. It's very hypothetical as well, playing with different theories, trying to build them together. But I want it to be normatively useful for design purposes. And also, according to one reviewer, I think they mentioned that this is a linear I kind of put a linear progression of norm to law to numbers to code, but that's really far away from what I'm trying to do. I put it in the methodology section, I think, very clear that there's no linear progression I'm proposing, or I'm not saying that's the normative. I'm just trying to provide a descriptive framework, trying to understand the different modes of governance, that how do they come together. And if this is not descriptive framework, we can use empirical evidence to test it or to like challenge it or modify it. But it helps us to generate, for example, empirical case studies, do interviews to see how these different modes interact in a vertical or horizontal way. So there's some caveats, and now we come to the contribution. So it's original framing to understand the code versus law debate by using a layering framework, which provides explanation why law doesn't fade, wither, or but it can grows with code together. And it raised the complementarity hypothesis and warned us of the very big negative consequences. And also it's because existing literature focuses on the tension usually just between law with another single mode of governance. There are a lot of literature between law and social norms. There's a lot of them about numbers, indicators, credits, or about law versus code. But it's really hard to see you braid these four modes together. For example, Lessig did very early on, but it's a little bit of a tangent with what we kind of call here. There he has the four modes of regulation, but in less of using the governance idea. And the second one is to provide the hypothesis, as I said, to inform more empirical studies and the effective design, which is normatively useful in law and governance, instead of being a normative framework. And I will give two very preliminary cases to illustrate how, or test like how this hypothesis works.
Have the mic, yes. You just have 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
So it also implies that each layer needs to provide like societal feedback, and lawyers should probably speak out more in the intermediate level. So yeah, if I don't have that much time, we can use the Q&A to delve more into the case. So layering is like a volcano, that there is social practice at the very down bottom, I call it magma, and then it goes up by abstraction. So governance defined by commons very early on has to be involved with conflict, mutuality, and order. For example, nuclear governance of non-proliferation is kind of resolving conflict and exerting order at a global level. And norms starting from informal to laws formal, that is the modern state. And then going to like quantification data sets and code that has learning, and use 0 and 1. So this is a chart of the abstraction from social practice, magma, to all the way to 0 and 1, the code, which has more disambiguation and completeness, but have less open interpretability or plasticity. Yeah, I don't think I have much time to. If I can give a very brief introduction to this idea in a small cases, that, for example, in the gig economy, that you have the social practice of Uber drivers delivering things or driving people, and then there's social norms about are these Uber drivers employees or independent contractor in labor law? But then in the UK, the 2021 Supreme Court judge defined a new category, basically worker. Then any kind of previous data sets involving, for example, Uber drivers will have to put a new data category because they don't just self-generate these categories, right? So statisticians, economists need to work with lawyers to get these new categories into their Excel sheets and to generate statistical analysis. And then code as well, if you have automated text generator or benefit algorithms, this new data set, what category will definitely lead to certain drift in the model can decay, which can decay. And
So
by
your 10 minutes
renewing
are
it.
over.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm happy
so
to.
if you can do your last slide, like, and wrap up.
Yeah. So there's the historical evidence I will jump through. So yeah, from law to numbers and numbers to code, you have Katerina Pistor and you have Zubas arguing from law to numbers and law to code what are the negative path dependencies could be. So the conclusion is a recap of governance by algorithm is a hybrid existing modes of governance, and law situates as a junction between social norms and numbers and code, like in an intermediate level abstraction. It's sustaining a societal space for normativity with feedback both upwards and downwards, kind of channel the heat from the immediate changes, but also maintain a global structure of normativity by providing a cooling mechanism, I call it, from the higher level, from top down. So it's against existing literature that propose like substitution or flatten the modes of governance, or just focus on one part of dichotomy. Okay, and this is the yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to Professor, and now I have to be precise again, Noura Al-Moubayed, Associate Professor at the Computer Science Department at Durham University.
Thank you. So thank you for presenting the paper. It was a very interesting paper to read. I usually read very technical papers, and it was an educational journey for me to read this paper and go through the concepts of law when you look at numbers and coding. I wasn't even aware that machine learning is called coding in the law world. So it's just such a good opportunity for me to learn about this concept. So the paper proposed this new framework, a novel framework that takes into account social norms, law, numbers or statistics, and also coding in the merit of machine learning and deep learning, and try to compare and contrast and discuss whether replacement is possible and why it's not possible. It focuses also on scaling and layering. And my understanding is that this natural evolvement of the field from social norms all the way to coding appeared of necessity for scaling up to apply specific laws or many laws or on bigger and bigger population, maybe globally as well. What I found interesting is when the paper talks about social norms, it talks about them being a product of belief, people belief, and therefore there is high importance of honesty, trust, fairness, and equality. But it's very difficult to achieve this in a slightly bigger scale, in equal way, because of there's like the paper talks about like tribal and the possibility of corruption, and therefore we need the law. But the law will normalize this, give us this formulation of when we can do what, and maybe give more fairness and equality to society without subjective bias. And later on, there is this jump to numbers, but that, which is very valid. We need those numbers to quantify the laws maybe. But I felt there is a gap between where the social norms was justified, and therefore the laws were like to enforce the social norms, and then the numbers, there is no connection. Well, how did that maintain trustworthiness or fairness or equality? And did something get dropped in the middle? Do they really like this layering? Do they really present the upper layer of social norms and law, or they're totally disconnected and they are there for convenience? And then there is the coding. This is my first time to present, and so please correct me, or like if I'm talking too much, let me know. And there is the coding. The coding comes from like a machine learning perspective, and it's to make the law more like a factory level, like scale it up to a degree that was unachievable before. With statistics, there was no decision making. There was like maybe statistical summaries for decision makers then to take decisions. But with coding, these models can take decisions, or potentially can take decisions that can kill people or save people's lives. Again, I felt that there is a disconnection. Like, it was very clear how law was evolved from social norms. It wasn't clear how statistics was evolved from the law, or even coding. Also, coding was described, machine learning, deep learning, and I think mentioned like deep neural network and convolutional neural network. I think it was like too simplified. It missed out on the language models, for example, large language models right now, because there is a lot of discussion around natural language and how law use that natural language to allow some interpretability or different interpretability of laws. And that does not exist with stats or numbers and codes. And missed out the point. It was like there is this natural language, like large language models like GPT-4, for example, or any other language models that's existed for a decade, not just this year, but it just happened that the media covered it this year. And like, can we reprogram or restructure or reformulate those models with natural language? It's possible. It's maybe people would argue it's possible, not possible, but there is a big argument that this is possible. People are doing this right now. There is platform just to build algorithms with pure text. So with that cut on the numbers phase, like the importance of numbers isn't clear to me anymore, except that, well, we need numbers to train models, but not stats though. And also I felt like the explainability or the lack of explainability for the codes is slightly missed in the paper. So to scale up, you need to go through like step by step, the paper call it process. The step by step does not exist in coding. We don't do anything step by step. You just throw a lot of data on very large computational model and you expect it to learn everything. There is no step by step. It's a black box. We don't know what's happening there. We don't know how the learning is happening. And therefore, most of these models are unexplainable. There's some attempts to explain them to some extent. That's align it with expert explanation, for example. So the learned outcome is agreeable with an expert, but there is no true explainability for it. This also produced some disagreement with the claim that scaling up requires things to be clear and well formalized, and there is no ambiguous aspects into it, when coding is quite ambiguous. So how can we scale it up when it's ambiguous? It's a bit like the social norms, when sometimes you can't explain it because it's subjective and have a lot of emotional aspects into it. That's why we require law. And I think coding to some extent reflects those social norms in a way of it is disambiguous and it can be explained step by step, but we still scale it up which is like, is it the right thing to do?
One more minute.
I just want to talk about bias as well, because social norms, I think would be really interesting to see this in the paper, added in the paper, because social norms, they're social norms, and we are human beings, and we're biased and horrible in so many ways, and good in so many other ways, luckily. And we saw many models, language models and vision models exposing our biases, right? So exposing what's wrong in our social norms that were regularized by laws. How does that bring code closer to social norm in the core rather than in a shell outside? Will code be able at some point to correct social norms rather than the other way around, to represent it, and control the scaling to become a scaling of the not the acceptable social norms, but the fair social norms, and get rid of the unfair social norms somehow. So instead of having it a tool to scale up, a tool to correct what we already have, as we never had these tools before that can learn from such a trillion billions of data samples, of any data samples, of any modality, and expose what's wrong in this data from different perspectives, different cultures, especially that we know most of this laws, numbers, and coding were a product to help a specific race in this world, and it's the white race. So how much is this we pay attention to and use the coding as a tool rather than to scale up, as a tool to correct what's wrong or to identify those.
I have to stop you,
yes.
because otherwise. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
And because we are running out of time, which was also caused by the previous session, of course, I'm going to immediately move to the audience, because I think for Zhenbin, it's very important to get as much feedback as possible. Sayosh Kapoor, and then Johannes.
Yeah, thank you so much for the thought-provoking talk. I guess this is like a question about the categories that are used in the original paper and how generalizable they are. So for example, like at the levels of social norms and laws, I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about how norms turn into laws or whatever. But I think at the numbers of, like at the two layers of numbers and code, it kind of seems, I'm not sure, I might be misunderstanding, but it kind of seems like a category error, because I think what's being talked about here is real world data or like real world events that happen in the world, as well as how we enforce things when it comes to it, right? And so numbers and code seem like a specific instantiation of these two more general categories. So code allows us to scale up enforcement, sure, but the thing that's being talked about is enforcement. And similarly, like numbers are a specific kind of data, but what we really want is what happens in the real world. What's being talked about is how things or how laws like affect what's happening in the real world. So to me, and again, this is not a critique. I think this is just something that came to my mind. And it was like, I think really generative, these four categories. One other question / suggestion is the model of social media content moderation, because I think that's where we really see this complementarity like play out. We have social norms which are turned into the laws of social media platforms. Whether they're considered legitimate or not is a separate question, but there's very much this process of creating policies. Then we have data on how real world users interact on these platforms. And that data is used either to create machine learning algorithms to moderate social media content, or it is also like at the level of code, it's not just social machine learning, but I think there's also the other aspect of enforcement, which is, as Professor Al-Moubayed's comment brought out, like the factory model of making decisions, which on social media very much is carried out also by humans. We have like tens of thousands of content moderators making these decisions on a daily basis. So I just felt that that might be like a useful sort of analysis to draw out these categories a little bit more and to generalize them to settings beyond just like the specifically legal to platforms which are acting almost as the de facto legal authorities on a large amount of our communications. But yeah, thank you so much for the excellent paper. It brought out like a lot of thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to continue to solicit questions, and then I will give the last word to Zhenbin. Johannes?
Hello, Zhenbin. Many thanks for that talk. Sorry. Hello, Zhenbin. Many thanks for that talk. It was very interesting. I have a very short question that requires a really long answer, I suppose. How does that layered model of code, numbers, laws, and social norms relate to the social credit system in China? You mentioned it yourself. And how does that relate to surveillance capitalism, which you also mentioned? And how would that relation for China and for the US, or perspectively, be different regarding a different conception of the relationship between the state and the private sector?
Is there any, that's a fantastic question, of course. I think Frank Pasquale wrote a very interesting article about the knowledge problem, about how very big tech companies, because they control so much information, look very much like Soviet planning economy. And I think your question relates directly to that. Are there any more questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Just one observation. I have many, but I try to be concise. I find a bit problematic your linear progression in levels of abstraction from social norms to code. Actually, that the law is a protocol of social norms is a theory, but it's not. It was also meant to be the other way around. So law altering social norms. So I think that in these layers, you should also consider the interaction and the intertwinings between the different levels. So you cannot probably separate that way. And also the fact that, yes, code regulates, but the law regulates in a different way than code. So you shall probably distinguish the kind of normativity that is implied by code and by the law. And there, so you also maybe could consider whether you retain a purely formal notion of the law, or if you incorporate some substantial notion of the law, including the respect, for instance, of the rule of law, and then it may help in disentangling a bit these levels. But thank you so much for your contribution.
Fantastic. Any more comment or question for Zhenbin? In that case, I'm inviting you to respond very briefly.
Much. Very quickly to the last one, I'm again saying this is not a linear progression model. I'm just trying to discuss the different abstraction kind of layers that based on the abstract level of the language, basically. And yes, I agree with the legitimacy, rule of law is very important. But I'm trying to say law here is discussed as the modern state law. As you said, it's related to legitimacy, but I don't use it as a tautological kind of concept as law has the highest authority. Otherwise, we can't really discuss it in a sociological sense. Like this legitimacy, as you said, has to be earned, like social norms or code. And then I really appreciate Noura's very, very great comments, and I really got a lot from it. I think the first one, I think, is that the disconnection between norms and laws and numbers, I didn't have time to fully explore it in the presentations. For example, a more concrete, also related to the question about the data, the four categories. I think it's related to, for example, Pistor's book about the code of capital, where she says, let's imagine the assets around a table, this computer. These are all physical objects, and we have social norms again about it, like who has exclusive rights to own it or prevent other people using it. And these are the social norms that we start obeying once law have certain concept about it in different places, different languages. People have shared ideas of property, or it's very individualized capitalist understanding of property, and that generates into different laws, use different natural language in different countries. That's why we have jurisdictions and comparative law, and then the global governance, the code of capital basically saying we have all these very diverse sets of things, norms and laws, but how a global capitalist society work, how the financial capital work, to put them all into this calculus or calculation of assets and make transactions possible at a greater scale, from the tribal we had, the social norms, to the impersonal trade of modern state, and to now the global kind of transaction of financial capital, which later goes to, she discussed about the financial crisis, how this use of number generating very large scale cooperation can fail once it encroach on the foundation of the legitimacy. Well, it's like exactly to what the last problem is, that once you scale it up, the bottom layer of legitimacy will be challenged very easily. And the code is another layer to that. I really appreciate Johannes' comment about the surveillance capitalism and social credit. One thing I see very similarly, like Muriel said, it's very centrally planned actually, because once you have it, like a very top layer of standardization and calculation, it's much harder to go deep down to the bottom layer. And it's more about the winning a legitimacy at the top layer, right? So they're all competing to get more legitimacy. After the financial crisis, let's say the profession of bankers or like the central banks, they will start to lose they will give in certain legitimacy back to law. And law as well will give in legitimacy back to, for example, local social organizations that will generate new social norms about property, about how we regulate finances, how we debunk like bad assets or bad kind of derivatives. And that's why the Basel III agreements came into financial regulation. And this new kind of culture of data scientists after the financial crisis also is trying to win this legitimacy for global governance, right? So surveillance capitalism is basically saying all these tech firms are trying to create this new culture of governance or information civilization based on the previous capitalist extraction logic, which provides a new legitimacy where people believe in this kind of thing. So I agree with Noura that in practice, like the ML, I really want to work with you more maybe on developing how like GPT-4, how these language models in specific ways create better understanding of social norms, help local community to generate better or select out good social norms. But at a higher level, to maintain this, what I said, of the cooling of this authority from the global level, the new kind of big tech companies grasp this power from different modes of governance and try to use it as a way of knowledge, like knowledge organization in a centrally planned way, even though they have the methods to do it in a more decentralized way. So maybe it's kind of, why I say it's a descriptive framework, it's not a normative one, it's because once you reach that level of governance, maybe it is, you need something, like some kind of a culture to be a dominant one for that authority to generate, to coordinate among like different languages, cultures, jurisdictions, different financial kind of regulations.
Sorry, Zuo, I have to stop you because
thank you. I think that's my response. I'm really,
very much.
very excited
we
by
have
these questions.
Three people waiting online, and thank you very much for the speakers of this session. Zhenbin Zuo, Noura,